When we think of the Black Death, certain images immediately come to mind. Mass graves, quarantined cities, and perhaps most hauntingly, the figure of the plague doctor, wandering through pestilence-ridden streets wearing that unmistakable mask. You know the one, the leather face covering with dark glass eye holes and that long curved beak jutting forward like some monstrous bird. It's become an icon of medieval horror, featured in everything from video games to carnival celebrations. But here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't just theatrical costume design. That elongated beak wasn't meant to intimidate the dying or create an imposing silhouette. It had a very specific, calculated purpose. And understanding why requires us to abandon modern medical knowledge and enter the mindset of 17th century physicians, who were desperately trying to protect themselves from an invisible enemy they completely misunderstood. The beak's length wasn't arbitrary. Its shape wasn't decorative. Every centimeter of that protrusion was engineered based on the leading scientific theory of disease transmission at the time. A theory that, while entirely wrong by today's standards, made perfect logical sense within their framework of understanding. Today, we're examining the plague doctor's mask through the lens of historical medicine, urban planning, and the desperate measures authorities took to maintain order during catastrophic outbreaks. What you'll discover is that the beak's design reveals something profound about how our ancestors understood contagion, air quality, and the very nature of illness itself. The question isn't just, why did they make it this way? The question is, what did they believe would happen if they made it any shorter? Let's begin in 1656, in a city on the brink of collapse. The plague doctor's iconic beaked mask first appeared in the early 17th century, though plague itself had ravaged Europe for centuries before. The Black Death of 1347 to 1353 killed an estimated 60% of Europe's population, returning in waves for the next 300 years. By the 1600s, European cities had developed sophisticated, if grim, administrative systems for managing outbreaks. Plague doctors were municipal employees, hired by city councils and paid from public coffers. They weren't necessarily the most skilled physicians. Often they were second-rate medical practitioners, or even individuals with minimal training, who were willing to take the dangerous job when established doctors refused. Their role was both medical and bureaucratic. They documented cases, verified deaths for official records, performed autopsies to confirm plague diagnoses, and occasionally attempted treatment. But primarily, they were data collectors for the state. In cities like Venice, Rome, and later London and Paris, these figures became essential components of plague management infrastructure. The uniform itself was standardized by Charles Delorme, physician to the French king around 1619. Delorme designed the complete protective costume: waxed leather overcoat, gloves, boots, wide-brimmed hat, and the mask. This wasn't folk costume or superstition. It was official medical equipment prescribed by medical authorities and required by municipal contracts. The doctors moved through quarantine neighborhoods carrying wooden canes to examine patients without direct contact, to point at things, and occasionally to move bodies or clothing. They were figures of authority representing the state's presence in zones of death. When you saw the beaked silhouette approaching, it meant the plague had officially arrived in your district. The psychological impact was deliberate. These weren't healers in the comforting sense. They were inspectors, documentarians of dying. Their appearance needed to command respect and maintain distance simultaneously. And that beak? It was the most critical component of their survival equipment. Look at any authentic plague doctor mask from the 17th century and you'll notice something immediately. The beak is dramatically, almost absurdly long. Not just a small protrusion, but a significant extension, typically measuring between 15 and 25 centimeters, roughly 6 to 10 inches from the face. This wasn't a gradual design evolution. When Charles Delorme first proposed the mask design, the extended beak was already a central feature. Medical texts from the period explicitly discuss its dimensions, suggesting specific minimum lengths. Some masks featured beaks even longer than the standard, particularly in Italian city-states where plague protocols were most developed. The beak's interior was hollow but not empty. Contemporary accounts describe it being filled with various aromatic substances: dried flowers, herbs, camphor, cloves, laudanum, rose petals, and most importantly, sponges or cloth soaked in vinegar or other strong-smelling liquids. The mixture varied by region and physician preference, but the principle remained constant. What makes this curious is the specific emphasis on length in the medical literature. Physicians didn't simply recommend a mask with aromatics. They prescribed precise measurements. Shorter beaks were considered inadequate, even dangerous. Medical texts cautioned against reducing the beak's dimensions, treating its length as a critical safety feature rather than aesthetic choice. Compare this to other protective equipment of the era. Gloves could vary in thickness. Coat length was somewhat flexible. Boot height was negotiable. But the beak? That measurement was non-negotiable. It appears in municipal contracts, in medical treatises, in equipment requisition forms from plague-stricken cities. Why such obsession with this specific measurement? Why was distance from face to beak tip treated as a matter of life and death? The answer lies in what physicians believed was actually causing the plague, and they were absolutely fundamentally wrong. To understand the beak's design, we must first understand miasma theory, the dominant medical paradigm of the era. Physicians believed diseases spread through bad air, or miasmas, corrupted atmospheric vapors emanating from rotting organic matter, stagnant water, and the bodies of the sick and dead. This wasn't superstition. It was their best scientific explanation based on observable patterns. Plague always seemed worse in crowded, unsanitary neighborhoods. It intensified during hot months. Areas near swamps or open sewers suffered disproportionately. The correlation between foul odors and disease seemed undeniable. The theory held that these poisonous vapors could penetrate the body through any opening, but primarily through the nose and mouth during respiration. Once inside, they corrupted the body's internal balance of humors, causing illness. The closer you were to the source of miasma, the more concentrated and dangerous it became. Here's where the beak's length becomes critical. Distance equals dilution. Physicians believed that poisonous air weakened as it traveled through space. The further your respiratory system from the immediate source of contagion, the less concentrated the miasma you'd inhale. The beak functioned as an extended respiratory chamber. Air entering through the beak holes traveled 15 to 20 centimeters before reaching the physician's nose and mouth. During that journey, the aromatic substances inside were thought to purify or neutralize the corrupted air. Strong-smelling compounds like camphor and vinegar would overcome the putrid miasmas with their powerful fragrances. Think of it as a primitive air filtration system based on entirely incorrect principles. The length provided both physical distance and treatment time. Longer beaks meant more space for aromatics and more distance from concentrated infection. The glass eye coverings serve similar purposes, protecting the eyes from miasmic vapors while allowing vision. Every element created layers of protection based on the same principle. Maximize distance, minimize direct exposure. The plague doctor's appearance served purposes beyond mere protection. In the chaos of pandemic, the state needed visible symbols of authority and control. The bizarre, inhuman silhouette of the beaked physician represented governmental power asserting itself in zones where normal social order had collapsed. The mask's frightening appearance was, in fact, administratively useful. It maintained social distance automatically. Citizens kept away from plague doctors not just from fear of contagion, but from primal unease at the figure's appearance. This suited municipal authorities perfectly. Plague doctors needed to move through infected zones without being touched, grabbed, or impeded by desperate families. The beak made the wearer immediately recognizable from great distances. In an era before standardized uniforms, this mattered immensely. City guards needed to identify plague doctors approaching quarantine cordons. Citizens needed to clear streets when one approached. The silhouette broadcasted identity more effectively than any badge or banner. There was also an element of psychological separation for the wearer. The mask dehumanized the physician, creating emotional distance from the suffering they witnessed daily. You weren't a person examining dying children. You were a functional role, a mechanism of municipal health policy. The mask literally separated your human face from your professional actions. For the public, the mask represented the thin line between order and chaos. As long as plague doctors continued their rounds, documenting and recording, the machinery of government still functioned. When they stopped appearing, when even these grim figures abandoned the streets, true desperation set in. The beak's length contributed to this psychological architecture. A small mask might suggest a doctor taking precautions. The dramatically extended beak suggested someone entering a realm of extreme danger, a boundary crosser between the world of the living and the territories of death. It communicated, "This place is so contaminated that I must extend my very face away from it." Let's address the most persistent myth about plague doctor masks, that they were primarily meant to frighten away evil spirits or demons. This notion appears frequently in popular culture, suggesting medieval physicians were superstitious charlatans performing elaborate rituals. This is fundamentally incorrect. While supernatural beliefs certainly existed in the 17th century, the plague doctor's equipment was designed according to the established medical science of the era. Charles Delorme and his contemporaries weren't conjuring protection spells. They were applying rational principles based on miasma theory. Medical treatises from the period discuss the mask in entirely practical technical terms. They debate optimal beak length, compare aromatic formulations, and analyze effectiveness rates. These weren't mystical texts. They were attempting empirical medicine with the wrong underlying theory. Another common misconception. The plague doctors were all frauds or con artists preying on desperate populations. While competency varied, many were sincere medical practitioners working under extraordinarily dangerous conditions with limited tools. Municipal records show numerous plague doctors died in service, suggesting genuine risk-taking rather than cowardly deception. The notion that the beak was primarily a gas mask precursor is also misleading. While it does superficially resemble later respiratory protection, the design logic was entirely different. Gas masks filter particulates. Plague beaks were meant to transform bad air into good air through aromatic chemistry. Finally, many assumed these masks were used during the 14th century Black Death. They weren't. The iconic beaked design emerged in the early 1600s, nearly 3 centuries after the Black Death's peak. Earlier plague physicians used various protective measures, but the standardized beaked mask is specifically an early modern innovation. The mask represents something more interesting than superstition. It shows intelligent people applying rigorous logic to incorrect premises, creating elaborate solutions to problems they fundamentally misunderstood. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't ignorance. It's sophisticated reasoning built on flawed foundations. While Charles Delorme's design became widely adopted, significant regional variations existed. Italian city-states with their advanced medical universities and extensive plague experience developed particularly sophisticated versions. Venetian masks sometimes featured even longer beaks, occasionally reaching 30 centimeters, reflecting the Republic's commitment to elaborate protective protocols. German states produced masks with differently shaped beaks, some more curved, others nearly straight. The curvature wasn't merely aesthetic, it reflected different theories about how miasmic air moved and accumulated. A downward curve supposedly prevented concentrated vapors from rising directly into the nostrils. In some regions, particularly in Eastern Europe, the beaked mask never achieved standard adoption. Physicians used simpler cloth face coverings soaked in vinegar, or even just held aromatic sachets to their faces. Budget constraints and limited access to leather-working craftsmen meant many areas couldn't equip their plague doctors with full protective gear. English plague doctors during the 1665 London outbreak showed mixed adoption. While some wore complete continental-style outfits, others used modified versions or simply increased their use of aromatics without the mask. English medical authorities were somewhat more skeptical of elaborate protective costumes, preferring to emphasize quarantine and isolation measures. The aromatic contents also varied dramatically. Mediterranean physicians favored rose petals and amber. Northern European doctors preferred stronger scents, wormwood, mint, and camphor. Some recipes included substances we'd now recognize as mildly toxic, mercury compounds, arsenic derivatives, and strong acids, which likely caused more harm than protection. Not all plague doctors wore masks, even in regions where they were available. Private physicians treating wealthy families sometimes refused the costume, considering it beneath their dignity or unnecessary for their superior constitution. The mask became primarily associated with municipal doctors serving the poor, creating class distinctions even in protective equipment. By the 18th century, as plague gradually retreated from Western Europe and medical theory evolved, the beaked mask fell out of use entirely. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We don't actually know if the masks worked. Survival data for plague doctors is incomplete and contradictory. Municipal records document deaths among plague doctors, but don't systematically compare survival rates between those who wore masks and those who didn't. Some physicians credited the costume with their survival. Thomas Dekker, writing about London's plague, suggested protective clothing significantly reduced physician mortality. Other contemporary accounts express skepticism, noting that many fully equipped doctors still contracted plague, while some without protection survived. From a modern epidemiological perspective, the mask provided zero protection against Yersinia pestis, the bacterium causing plague. The primary transmission vectors were flea bites, and in pneumonic plague, respiratory droplets. Aromatics don't filter bacteria. Distance from patient faces might have slightly reduced droplet exposure, but the beak's length was irrelevant to this benefit. However, the full costume did offer some incidental protection. The waxed leather coat created a barrier against fleas, the actual transmission vector that doctors didn't recognize. Gloves prevented direct contact with infected bodily fluids. The wooden cane maintained physical distance. These elements, protected for reasons physicians didn't understand. There may have been a placebo effect for the doctors themselves. Believing they were protected might have enabled them to work more calmly and methodically, potentially reducing exposure through panicked, careless movements. Psychological confidence, even if based on incorrect beliefs, can influence behavior in ways that increase survival. The masks also enforced protocols. Putting on elaborate equipment reminded doctors to maintain distance, avoid unnecessary contact, and follow systematic procedures. Modern medical protective equipment serves similar psychological functions beyond physical barriers. So did the beak work? Not for the reasons physicians believed, but it was part of a system that might have provided marginal protection through unintended mechanisms. The wrong theory, accidentally producing slight benefits through behavioral changes. So why did plague doctor masks have those elongated beaks? The answer reveals everything about how humanity responds to invisible threats with the tools and knowledge available. 17th century physicians faced a genuine catastrophe. Plague killed indiscriminately, decimated cities, and overwhelmed every social system. They couldn't see bacteria. They couldn't understand transmission vectors. But they could observe, theorize, and attempt protection based on their best scientific framework. The beak's length wasn't arbitrary or theatrical. It was carefully calculated distance based on miasma theory's principles. Every centimeter represented physicians' desperate attempt to place space and purifying aromatics between themselves and what they believed was concentrated poisonous air. They were wrong about the mechanism. Completely, fundamentally wrong. Plague wasn't spreading through bad air. It was spreading through infected fleas and respiratory droplets. The beak did nothing to filter Yersinia pestis. The aromatics were useless against bacterial infection. But the design wasn't irrational. It was rationality applied to incorrect premises. It was intelligence, observation, and systematic thinking, all working together to solve a problem they misunderstood. In some ways, that's more haunting than simple superstition. They weren't fools ignoring evidence. They were scholars interpreting evidence through a flawed paradigm. The beaked mask reminds us that certainty isn't the same as correctness. These physicians were absolutely certain miasma theory explained disease. They built elaborate systems based on that certainty. They died wearing equipment designed to protect against threats that didn't exist while failing to address threats they couldn't see. When we look at that distinctive silhouette, we shouldn't just see medieval strangeness. We should see a mirror. How many of our own certainties, our elaborate systems, our carefully measured precautions, might be addressing entirely wrong problems? The beak measured distance from danger they completely misidentified. What are we measuring wrong today? The plague doctor's mask has survived in cultural memory long after miasma theory vanished from medical textbooks. It appears in steampunk fashion, video games, carnival costumes, and historical horror. But that distinctive beak deserves more than aesthetic appreciation or Halloween novelty. It represents a crucial moment in medical history when empirical observation, logical reasoning, and systematic methodology all work together, built on a foundation of fundamental misunderstanding. The mask is a monument to intelligent error, to humanity's capacity for elaborate, sophisticated, well-reasoned mistakes. The physicians who wore these masks weren't villains or fools. They were professionals attempting to fulfill their duties while protecting themselves, using the best science of their era. They documented outbreaks, verified deaths, attempted treatment, and maintained social order during civilization's darkest moments. Many died doing it. Their mistake wasn't stupidity, it was inevitability. They lacked microscopes, germ theory, epidemiological science, and centuries of accumulated knowledge we now take for granted. They worked with what they had, and what they had was miasma theory, aromatic herbs, and waxed leather. The next time you see that beaked silhouette, remember, it wasn't designed to look frightening or mysterious. It was designed to save lives by placing measured distance between a physician's face and concentrated poisonous air that didn't exist. The beak's length was calculated protection against an invisible enemy they completely misidentified. In trying to filter bad air, they accidentally created minor barriers against flea-borne bacteria they didn't know existed. Sometimes humanity's greatest accomplishments emerge from our most fundamental misunderstandings. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration of historical medical practice fascinating, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the obscure details that reveal how our ancestors understood their world. What other historical objects or practices should we examine? Leave your suggestions in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious about the past.